power was out. When my power was out 2 years ago, after about 4 days, I hadn't had a shower. I finally biked over to my friend Steve's in San Rafael, and he had a backup generator that ran his house, and I was able to take a hot shower. So it's appreciated, but obviously it's a public nuisance. So it's really a dumb way to do energy resilience, but unfortunately that's the default strategy. That reliance on diesel is also manifest writ large through our utilities. In late October, the PUC issued a proposed decision in the so-called emergency reliability proceeding that was all about, hey, okay, let's have more diesel gensets running everywhere to make sure that the power stays on through the 2022 fire season. So it's not a very smart way to run an electricity system. So next slide, please. So the point is obviously that California can do better. This is just a schematic of a microgrid. I could point out some of the components here and why they're relevant. The idea is you want to evolve to the current world where you have central station generation and electricity flowing one way, to a world where you have a vastly expanded quantity of distributed energy resources that are sort of alternating between consuming power and then sending power back on the grid, and then most importantly, sharing that locally. So I could get into some of the details here, but you see an electric car plugged in. Ideally, that electric car is charging up at work, potentially capturing that excess system peak that we have in the middle of the day, and then ideally, running their home or discharging to the broader grid between the evening ramp, 4 and 9 p.m., but keeping that energy locally. You would have a bunch of battery storage resources that are located locally, so that you have local resilience. And most importantly, the idea of a microgrid is this can disconnect or so-called island from the broader electricity grid, so that when the grid goes down, which it has recently a lot, the folks in an individual microgrid can continue to have power. And a microgrid can also operate under so-called blue sky conditions. When everything's fine, you can have all the battery storage and local PV available as a grid resource that can be sold into the wholesale market. So it's a more resilient, cleaner, local, better way to run an electricity system. Next slide, please. So this gets into some of the vision for where we could potentially go in terms of designing a system for the future. On the right is the wholesale power system, bulk power, and think about the big fat transmission lines that run across California Valley along Highway 5, which you've probably driven. And that power comes at transmission, and then it goes to typically a substation where that's stepped down, and then all the distribution circuits go off and to lower voltage. And that's kind of a key node point where the power is stepped down. And in many cases, what's being considered now to keep the lights on is installation of, in some cases, diesel generators or big battery banks, in some cases, or gas generators at substations in order to serve sort of the local distribution grid over on the left. Ideally, what happens is over on the left, when you have a distribution system, this distribution system is made up of a vast quantity of individual generators that are exporting to the grid occasionally, consuming when appropriate, and so-called load balancing locally. So the dream is an evolution to what we've sort of talked about as a distribution operator system. Right now, I mean, the investor-owned utilities, they operate the distribution system, but the load balancing is not happening at a distribution scale. It's happening at a wholesale transmission scale. There's a bunch of guys sitting in a big giant room up in Folsom, controlling minute by minute the power so that it matches supply and demand all the time. You could conceivably do the same thing at a distribution scale. So in a perfect world, you get to a world where at a distribution level, at lower voltage, you have local load serving, being served by local generation and balancing locally, and then interacting with the broader grid when needed. I'll talk more about some of the benefits of this in a minute. Next slide, please. Fraser, can you jump to the next slide?
Yep, just one moment. There we go.
I'm seeing the desert coalition. Okay, so here's just a couple columns, like what do we have now versus what do we want? Right now, we've got, just looking down on these columns, starting on the top left, you know, we've got crisis-driven reactions. You know, when in doubt, bring in more fossil generation. This is a decision that was made most recently, October 29th, by the PUC in response to planning for a fire season 2022. What you want is, over on the right, you know, you want bottom-up planning. You want people thinking locally about how to meet their energy needs locally and how to site that, instead of relying on people sitting in an office tower in downtown San Francisco in terms of how to meet that load. Everything right now back to the left is centrally planned. Well, you could actually unleash an open market on a distribution scale, just like there is currently an open market on the transmission scale. There's sort of federal law that says you have to have things called open access transmission tariffs, and you have to legally be able to put electricity on the transmission system and so-called wheel it to other points on the grid. Arguably, you can do the same thing on a distribution level, particularly with radical changes happening in what's available through distributed energy management systems. Right now, where we are now is distributed energy is kind of like it's viewed as a problem. I mean, left to their own devices, the utilities would just assume not have it. There's a big battle going on with net metering in California. We'll talk about that, I think, in a little bit with Rosanna and Carl. And the incumbent utilities, you know, they make a guaranteed rate of return on their assets, either transmission or distribution. And every time people are doing things locally, smarter, cheaper, cleaner, faster, better, that doesn't necessarily make money for the incumbent investor-owned utility. So it's a problem. The interconnection is complicated. It's kind of a long story that we get into, but the associated hassle associated with getting interconnection is always been a problem in California, well, everywhere basically, but we have our own problems in California. Ideally, you want to live in a world where it's, you know, simple, quick, cheap, fast, readily doable quickly without having to you know, have huge delays associated with building distributed energy. You know, our current system for energy resilience, as I talked about, is either the utilities do a massive power shutoff, which is a huge essentially value shift from consumers to investor-owned utility shareholders, essentially insuring them against, you know, wildfire losses. And it's all based on backup generators as well. That's insane. You want to live in a world where you have distributed, carbon-free, resilient electricity, particularly in vulnerable communities. Obviously, you know, I could handle $500 worth of lost groceries when the power was out 4 years ago, but if I was living on minimum wage, that $500 would be harder for me. So we need to get to a world where we're prioritizing keeping the lights on for the most vulnerable, which is not something we're doing right now. Right now, you have a guaranteed rate-based rate of return for the IOUs, and that is locking out the ability for a lot of innovation to happen by individuals, by private sector. We've essentially shut out all of the innovation that could potentially occur if we created a whole new structure. So how do we get to that world? Well, next slide, please. These are some numbers from Jerry Braun, and he sort of looked at the existing distributed energy asset base in California, and some of these numbers kind of pop. He put them in the highlighted on the right. So if you look at solar PV, he says, okay, well, maybe we got 9 gigawatts, maybe that's, you know, 19.5 by 2025. 40 gigawatts. So we got about 1 million electric vehicles driving around on the roads, and that's potentially 40 gigawatts of capacity right now. Well, you know, market's growing rapidly. That's potentially 100 gigawatts by 2025, which is coming up in 3 years. Put these numbers in perspective. So, you know, the evening ramp, are people familiar with the duck curve? Well, I'll just talk through it quick. Basically, what happens is we have a problem at the end of the day. Solar's coming offline, and there is a need for, you know, a lot of natural gas peaker plants to come online between 4 and 9 p.m. when the system load is going up and the solar is going down. So there's a huge demand that happens. Well, if that huge evening ramp right now in California, I mean, it varies a little bit seasonally, obviously, but just ballpark it at 12, 15 gigawatts or so of huge increase in power that needs to be made available fairly quickly as solar comes offline and the system load goes up. Well, if there's going to be 100 gigawatts of EVs driving around the roads by 2025, if we could say use 10% of them as a grid resource potentially and solve the duck curve problem, and that would basically be taking the offline, the gas peakers that are currently providing that power and creating a structure so that electric vehicles as well as home batteries are all providing a grid resilience asset for the broader system, which is a whole lot better than bringing online a lot of gas peakers. So the point is that we can do a lot with what we already have in California if we created a whole new architecture that is focused specifically on capturing the benefit of distributed energy. Next slide. So the idea that we've been promulgating at the Climate Center is something called community energy resilience planning. Basic idea is, instead of leaving all the decisions to distant decision makers, have local governments who obviously necessarily have exclusive jurisdictional authority over roofs and parking lots and streets where you can install EV charging and all these things, and have them systematically thinking about what this dramatic build out of distributed energy looks like, where it should go, what their priorities are, how much they're willing to pay, and then live in a world where there's a document which has been approved by a local government that a priori says, oh, it's okay to put EV charging infrastructure privately owned on all the streets, and it's okay to cover all the parking lots with solar, and it's okay to locate storage without having to go through a lot of permitting processes. Just like we, in some cases, have tried to streamline the installation of rooftop solar. Actually, DOE had a related initiative that came out recently. We need to do that much faster and essentially live in a world where every local government has a essentially pre-approved set of technologies and locations so that the private sector can come in and quickly make these things happen, commensurate with the local planning guideline. So, put the power in the hands of local governments and get to the world where this industry can accelerate at the degree to which we need to have it accelerate, given our resilience needs as well as our decarbonization needs. So final slide, our legislative agenda for 2022, we wrote a bill that like all the energy resilience bills died in the legislature in Sacramento this year, including ours. So Senator Dodd, who is the author of the bill, is going to rerun it, and we've been having related meetings with all parties. Arguably, the imperative for community energy resilience is just getting more and more. If you look at the data, so we're going to do that again, and then try to get a big bucket of money associated with how to execute not only on the planning of this per the Community Energy Resilience Act, but implementation. And that implementation, we think, needs to prioritize the folks most vulnerable. We had been working with a group of environmental justice organizations and others to get a chunk of money that was allocated by the PUC through a decision that was made early this year, $200 million to create community microgrids in vulnerable communities. The details on that program are going to be they're being ironed out as we speak, but that money will be available next summer. 200 million is great, but it's sort of a drop in the bucket relative to where we need to go. There's tens of thousands of critical facilities across California, and particularly in vulnerable communities. So we need to systematically do that for everybody in California that is needing reliable electricity. I think that's my 20 minutes. So I will pass it over to Rosanna and Carl. I guess we're doing questions at the end.
Thanks very much for that, Kurt. Appreciate it. And that was a really good high-level summary of where we were at. And certainly, I learned a little bit about the legislation there. And as we get into Q&A later in the session, I'll have a couple questions for you.
Great.
Thanks for that. Our next speaker is Rosanna Francescato. And Rosanna, I'm going to get a slideshow up for you. Give me just one moment to make this transition.
Okay.
There we go. Does that look about right?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Wonderful. Rosanna is from the Clean Coalition and is their communications director, and has served in a variety of roles. Has written extensively on clean energy for publications like Clean Technica, the PV Solar Report, PV Magazine, and Energy Central. Is also served on the steering committee for the local Clean Energy Alliance. And she joins us tonight from the Bay Area. So Rosanna, I know that was a brief summary of your bio. Full bios are posted on our website for this event. And I'll turn it over to you. Please take it away and let me know when you want me to move slides along.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Fraser. And thanks everyone for coming tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some policy issues that we're working on at the Clean Coalition. I think Kurt set the stage well, kind of explaining how complicated the policy landscape is and how many issues there are. And we're dealing with some that are maybe not quite so well known. So I think it's good to get the word out. So if you could go to the next slide. I want to start just by briefly covering who the Clean Coalition is and what we're all about. The Clean Coalition is a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and a modern grid. Our end game vision is that we will get to 100% renewable energy within the next 2 decades. Obviously, the sooner the better. And at the Clean Coalition, we're focused on the 25% of that end game that we believe needs to come from local renewable sources. And local means you're interconnected within the distribution grid where people live and work. Kurt talked a little bit about the different parts of the grid. And you're facilitating resilience, which is possible because you're avoiding any dependence on transmission lines, and long transmission lines are inherently not resilient. So I do want to mention that the 25% we mentioned here is the minimum. In many cases, we may be able to get to a larger percentage of local renewables. And there are places in the US and around the world that are doing that already. But we may still need to get up to 75% of our energy from remote sources. Of course, we'd like to keep that number on the smaller side. But we do believe that there is an important role for transmission, since we will need to get a certain amount of our energy from long distances. And we will need the transmission grid to do that. Now, in many cases, we will be able to use existing transmission lines as fossil fuel power plants are retired. And I just saw an article today that mentioned some technologies that are allowing more energy to go over existing transmission lines as well. So there are ways to avoid building a lot of transmission, but even if we need to build some new transmission, the transmission system is very expensive. So we have to get it right. We have to invest our dollars in a really intelligent way. And we have to also allocate the costs of the transmission system accurately and sensibly. Otherwise, we distort the market and we create cost shifts like the ones we have now in California. We need to ensure we're not stealing value from local renewables to ensure that we get to that 25% at least, and that we don't subsidize transmission interconnected energy and end up with too much of it. And of course, that could also mean more power generation in pristine areas like the desert, which we all want to avoid. So if you could go to the next slide. So transmission costs are absolutely out of control throughout the country. They're the fastest growing component of electricity bills in California. And here transmission already costs about the same as the energy itself. I don't know if you look at your bill a lot, but they're pretty hard to read, but you'll see the transmission costs in there. And soon it could actually cost more to move energy around than to generate it. And this is partly because of how the market is designed. So the utility business model allows utilities to get a guaranteed return on equity of 12% on all the build out. And Kurt talked a little bit about the transmission and distribution. I think that together comes to that 12%. This business model made some sense when, one, all energy was generated remotely, and two, we needed the utilities to build out our transmission system. But the situation today is very different, and we need a new utility business model. And this outdated model with a guaranteed ROE creates massive market distortions and conflicts of interest, which steal value from local generation and hurt ratepayers. And one of these market distortions is the erroneous metering and assessment of transmission access charges, or TAC, in California's investor-owned utility service territories. Next slide. I just want to mention briefly that transmission costs are even a lot higher than they seem, because when you add operations and maintenance plus the ROE, transmission costs go up 10 times beyond their initial capital costs, and these costs are borne by ratepayers. So next slide. So how do we avoid these huge costs? Well, it turns out that to optimize the grid for ratepayer savings, you need a lot of local renewables and energy storage. And Southern California Edison, a major utility, did some analysis on this a few years back, and they found that if you properly locate 4 gigawatts of local solar, you could preempt $2.2 billion in new transmission infrastructure investments in their service territory. And of course, that actually comes to about $20 billion in ratepayer savings when you consider the O&M and ROE. Next slide. So that was a study by a major utility, and their findings were actually contrary to their own self-interest. But this isn't just theoretical. It's not just in studies. Already in CAISO's 2017 to 2018 planning process, they deferred $2.6 billion in planned transmission spending. And that was in large part because of the increased deployment of local renewables, as well as increased energy efficiency. And you'll see in the next presentation today how a very sophisticated model shows that deploying more local renewables in close coordination with utility scale generation can save us even many more billions, and also, of course, minimize how much utility scale solar we build. Next slide. So transmission costs to ratepayers are huge and growing. And in California, we have a huge market distortion in the way transmission access charges, or TAC, are metered and assessed. And this means that California ratepayers are paying more than we should for the transmission system, and local renewable energy projects are disincentivized. So here you see an illustration of the distribution grid and the transmission grid. And I don't know how familiar everyone here is with the different parts of the grid, but you can see that the distribution lines are the ones closer where people live and work, and they're usually the wooden poles and wires that you see outside your home. And the transmission lines are the higher voltage lines you see on the big metal towers. So TAC are the usage fees for the transmission grid for both the high voltage lines and low voltage lines. And in California's investor-owned utility service territories, these fees are being metered and assessed incorrectly at the customer meter, as you can see in this slide. That means you can't tell whether that energy came from the solar rooftop next door or from a power plant 1,000 miles away. They're treated exactly the same. And that's regardless of the fact that the remote energy used the transmission grid and the locally generated energy didn't use it at all. If you could click next slide just to get to the next piece of this slide, great. So it turns out that, oh, you can go back, sorry. Yeah, it just added a little bit to the slide. In municipal utility service territories, at least most of them in California, TAC are already being metered and assessed correctly at the substations that you see here between the low voltage and high voltage lines, and then the low voltage lines and the distribution lines. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel to do this right. We do need to change the utility business model, but we can fix TAC even before doing that. The only issue is, of course, that the utilities will fight this change because it does hurt their business model. Next slide. So the upshot is that the way that TAC are being assessed in IOU service territories just doesn't make sense. It's like paying extra shipping and handling fees for something you picked up next door, or paying a toll for the Golden Gate Bridge if you pull into your driveway at home. This is clearly where the cost shift is happening in California, so we have to fix this. Next slide. And we have to fix it not only because we ratepayers are paying these costs, but also because TAC distorts the market by making remote generation look a lot cheaper than it is. 3 cents per kilowatt hour is being stolen from local renewables, which makes them look more expensive. And this distortion makes it harder to deploy more distributed energy resources and avoid building large power plants in the desert. So these charts show how that's happening. It seems intuitive that you get economies of scale with utility sales solar compared to rooftop solar, right? And we'll talk about that in the next presentation too. In the chart on the left, you can see how when we ignore transmission costs, remote generation does indeed look cheaper because, you know, per unit it is cheaper. But when you transport that energy over the transmission grid, you have additional costs associated with the transmission, and that comes to that 3 cents per kilowatt hour. So one thing I want to note here is that since this cost is socialized to all of us ratepayers, when load serving entities like IOUs and CCAs buy energy, they ignore that cost and they buy the energy that's cheaper for them. But guess what? It's more expensive for all of us. So once we fix the TAC distortion and make these transmission costs visible, then local renewables look a lot more cost effective, as you can see in the chart on the right. Plus, you get resilience, like Kurt was talking about, and many other benefits at no extra cost. Next slide. Right, so since transmission costs are increasing rapidly, of course, TAC are also increasing. And in 20 years, TAC are expected to be at 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's where you get the levelized costs that we were talking about of TAC at 3 cents. And that 3 cents is about 50% of the average wholesale cost of electricity in California. So that is huge. Next slide. So at the Clean Coalition, we did a deep analysis on this, and we found that if you fix the TAC market distortion, we'll end up with a lot more local renewables in the next 20 years. If we continued with business as usual, we'd have something like 12% of our energy coming from local renewables. But if we fix TAC, we can get that to over 30%, and we can save Californians over 60 billion over 20 years. Plus, of course, we'll have a lot better outcomes for local renewables. So next slide. The truth is, there's a lot more solar siting opportunity on rooftops than people think. And remember, rooftops doesn't just mean people's houses. It also means commercial buildings, municipal buildings, schools, and this includes parking lots. And at the Clean Coalition, we do a lot of solar siting surveys that identify the technical solar siting potential in urban areas. And we found tons of solar siting potential even in densely populated areas on rooftops, parking lots, and parking structures. And you can see here that the Solar Rights Alliance recently put out a video, and they noted that California could put solar on over 400 square miles of rooftops. So we really can avoid at least some of the large solar plants in the desert. Next slide. In addition to rooftops and parking lots, though that is our focus at the Clean Coalition, I just happened to see the story today about a new study showing how much solar we can site on landfills. And that's another great way to use already compromised land and not build the big power plants in the desert. As you can see here, we can generate a pretty significant portion of our electricity by deploying solar on closed landfills. So that's another huge opportunity. Next slide. So to get more local renewables in California, one thing we need to do, among many others, like Kurt was talking about, is to fix the transmission access charges market distortion. So how do we fix TAC? Well, our proposed reform is pretty simple. Only charge transmission fees for energy that's delivered through the transmission system and have procurement reflect both the energy purchase price and the delivery charges. There's a lot of support for this. We've gotten nearly 90 organizations to sign on to our campaign, and I think we've gotten a couple more in recent days. Next slide. But all this has taken time. We went through a lengthy stakeholder process with CAISO a few years back, and CAISO agreed that TAC reform is needed, but said that the CPUC would need to take action because it's an interagency issue, and they're not wrong. You saw before in the slide that Kurt showed how complicated all the interactions of all these agencies can be, and in fact, this could include the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So there are various agencies that need to work together. But we've also talked to some staff at the CPUC, and they've agreed that the issue should be taken up. They don't know where to fit it in their proceedings, and they're not going to do anything unless they're compelled to. So we need legislation to compel both CAISO and the CPUC to take action. And we actually have some draft legislation that's been approved by Legislative Council. And we've been shopping around to California state legislators, some of whom are considering including tax reform language in legislation this coming year. As Kurt alluded to, it's been a little tricky because all these energy bills keep being put off and they have limits in how many bills they can put forward, but we're continuing to try on that. And I think one of our biggest challenges is that tax reform can seem like an obscure issue. And also legislators are worried they'll be confronted with this cost shift argument, which we know is bogus, but it keeps coming up. Because really there's already a cost shift from the utilities to all of us, and we want to fix this. But as kind of in the weeds and wonky as tax reform can seem, it's really key to deploying more local renewables. And luckily, more people are starting to see how important this is. So if you'd like to join in this work or just sign your organization on as a supporter, you can contact me or go to the links that are shown here. And I'm happy to share all these slides afterwards too. Next slide. I just wanted to point out one other action you can take. This is not a Clean Coalition initiative, but right now there's an urgent action going on, and you can go to this petition shown here. It's urging Governor Newsom to save California solar by stopping the utilities from gutting net metering, which has been key to getting us over 1 million solar roofs in California. So if you can sign this petition today, that would be great. I don't know how familiar people are with net metering, but if you have solar on your roof, you get a credit for any solar you're not using. For instance, during the day, maybe your usage is low, but you're generating a lot of solar. You send that back to the grid and you get a credit. And that's really been key for rooftop solar. And the utilities are, as always, trying to stop it. So that's something that you can do. Right now, I think this number is getting probably even closer to 100,000 than when I took this screenshot earlier today. And next slide. I just want to leave you with a few final thoughts, which is that the real cost shift in California is excessive transmission spending. Our current system is outdated, and that's what is shifting costs. And our proposed tax reform will help fix that existing cost shift and lower costs for all ratepayers. And tax reform is one necessary piece of the puzzle to accelerate and facilitate local renewables, which will provide us resilience, boost local economies, and create jobs. We have lots of places where we can deploy local renewables. We haven't come anywhere close to maximizing our use of rooftops, parking lots, and parking structures for solar. And we need to fix the real cost shift that's happening in California. That's vital that we implement the policies and market fixes that we need to deploy more local renewables so that we can meet our clean energy goals and get the energy resilience we need, as well as the many other benefits of local renewables. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Rosanna. And that was really, really succinct and a lot of great information.
There's a lot there, I know.
It's really good though. I wasn't familiar with the transmission access charges items. So I've got a couple questions for you as we get onto the Q&A. But I would like to move ahead and introduce our next speaker, Carl Rubago. Carl, if you want to go ahead and take over and share your slides with the group.
I sure will. Okay, I'm going to stop your sharing by taking over. And I can do that because I'm a host and I'm all powerful. It says I'm screen sharing. So I'll put this into presentation mode and then take it out of presentation mode and use slideshow, which is what they always tell me to do. It looks good to me, but I'm gonna wait. I have to hit another button.
No,
all right.
It looks good to us too, Carl. And Carl, you're joining us from Denver, Colorado. Is that right?
I am. I'm from chilly Denver, Colorado, my home for the last, well, just before the pandemic and a couple other times in my life. Yeah. And there's more information about me on the website, so I won't go into a long bio. Let's just say I've had the chance to spend a lot of time in the electric utility industry, and I really enjoy what I'm about to talk about, which is modeling. And after what you heard from Kurt and what you heard from Rosanna, that the question that some policymaker or some decision maker is going to throw back into your face is, well, how much of this stuff do we need to do? And is it a good deal to do it, right? Because the politics is about rationing and economics is about rationing scarcity. And you people believe in, preserving the environment and in a future for your neighbors and your planet, but is it really worth it, to have a future? And how much should we spend on it? And is your way really the best way? Are the kinds of implicit questions that get shoved at us every time we make these advocacy claims. In the electric utility business, we rely on two particular kinds of models, analysis tools, in order to help answer those questions. And they're called production cost and capacity expansion modeling. So I'm sure everybody here knows how to do and how capacity expansion and production cost modeling works, right? Thumbs up. Yeah. And then you're all like going, what is he talking about? The truth is, every single one of you knows how production cost and capacity expansion modeling works because it's part of daily life. You just haven't assigned that kind of technical sounding name to it. Production cost is basically what's the next best thing you buy when you need something. So imagine that that the family is coming over and you decided to make your famous spaghetti recipe and you look in the pantry and you're a little short on tomatoes. If you're like me, the last time you went to the grocery store deciding to buy some canned tomatoes, and just say it's canned tomatoes for this story, you get to that section of the store and you're befuddled by the range of choices. They all come in pretty much the same size of cans, either the big cans or the little cans. Ignore that stuff on the bottom shelf with all the dust on it. Nobody ever buys that many tomatoes. I don't even know why they sell those. But once you zero in on how many tomatoes you want, or how much tomatoes you want, you start comparing by price and your characteristics and will they fit in with the recipe that you typically make. The next can of tomatoes, choosing which is the next can of tomatoes to put into your shopping basket and your shopping bag is a production cost decision. So we all make these kinds of decisions, and if you let the wheels turn, you'll realize that you do this for a whole lot of things, but groceries are a really good example for that. A similar example, and I'll stick with tomatoes. Well, the easiest example for me, actually, I'm married to a quilter, and the acquisition of new sewing machines is capacity expansion in her studio loft. But let me stick with tomatoes for a little bit. Let's say that you like cooking with tomatoes so much and you're tired of going to the store. You decide to take a hand at growing some of your own tomatoes. In deciding whether or not you're going to go through that and whether or not you're going to continue to rely on the store and make more frequent trips to the store, or whether you're actually going to start growing some of your own tomatoes and expand your capacity for tomato production at your home, is a question of capacity expansion. And so we make those kinds of decisions in our ordinary life as well. I'm going to talk about bringing modern, super duper, much smarter computing power to the utility industry. I'm going to give you the highlights of the results, but it's really captured right here in this first slide, which says that if we take advantage of sustainable growth in our local solar, in California, you can save over $120 billion on utility costs and reduce utility costs for every customer in California out to the year 2050. So with that introduction, buckle up and understand, by the way, that this website that I've listed here provides a narrative explanation of this talk, a copy of this presentation, a press release that explains it in ordinary language, and many more resources and examples of studies like this that we have done. But this one's California specific, and I thought that'd make it interesting to you. When it comes to deciding what the next best thing to do in the electric utility business, a lot of us come to the story and come to the question with the mental furniture that we have in place, the arrangement of that mental room, if you will. And it typically, in this country today, and based on years and years of experience, it typically is arranged in such a way that it assumes that the next best resource is another large central station power plant, because the bigger they are, the cheaper the product is. And since we need a lot of this, if we're going to get rid of our greenhouse gas emissions, large solar, we'll need large solar and we'll need large wind because it's the cheapest way to get us there. That's what we bring to the game in terms of a predisposition. But in fact, if we enable ourselves to really consider the attributes of distributed resources, if we really think about the trade-offs between driving to the store and growing a little pot of cherry tomatoes, or maybe even a bed of tomatoes for your own household, we start realizing that sometimes the least cost, healthiest, and most rewarding option might be a local resource. But in the utility business, we didn't have models that could handle that. And I'm going to explain why. So with that sort of as a premise, the real question that's sitting on the table, the research theory, is here, is that California's made a good start on distributed resources. You lead the country in net metering. You've got lots of big solar and wind going. Some of the first big wind farms were Tehachapi and places like that, Altamont. You broke ground on how to do the rates so that those technologies could succeed. Rosenfeld and energy efficiency, you've done a great job of making your overall use of electricity more efficient. The question we have is, if California sustains market growth for rooftop solar and enables markets for distributed solar and community solar, is it worth it? Is it the right thing to do? Will it save money? And how much of it should you do? So that's the question we wanted to ask, just like I started this presentation with. Let's talk about what we found when we asked the question. The answer is that if you grew local solar to 65 gigawatts by the year 2030, so that's a couple times more than we need just in the next decade, and continued growth all the way out to 2030, and 2050. And if you grow the complementary distributed storage along with that in order to enable the performance of those distributed resources, you could save that $120 billion. You'd grow a distributed storage market of about 60 gigawatts as a complement. You'd avoid your carbon dioxide emissions faster, and you could create an incremental 374,000 jobs. So this small stuff is good stuff, and it has a lot of potential benefits if you go down this path. So what did we do? Well, let's go back to that modeling problem, right? The real problem is that we have last century's thinking about how the utility business should work, large, and I think it was Rosanna explained this. It's like, or Kurt, I'm sorry, I forgot which one, but it's basically, in the old days, we had this rate making formula and we wanted to encourage the building out of infrastructure. Now we have the infrastructure, but we can't get off the treadmill, and the utilities want to keep building capital projects. So we have last century's business model, and last century, or even older than that, actually, the centuries before, if you really count it right, we have last century's computers, which couldn't handle the sophisticated calculations of really looking at things on the small side of the system. We had limited amounts of data and experience. We didn't think of that little stuff as actually being, serious in any way. The super mega grocery store doesn't worry about your little pot of tomatoes. If you need a big pot of spaghetti, you're going to come see them. Dang it, they're the ones that have the tomatoes that you're going to need, right? So the way we came at the problem and our capabilities limited our ability to look at things, and our solutions, not surprisingly, were always big solutions. But then things changed. A guy named Dr. Christopher Clack, who created Vibrant Clean Energy, and other people in the industry, we worked with Dr. Clack, started bringing supercomputing thinking and big data model thinking to the utility industry, because the utility industry is a big data problem. And they actually used models that were built around weather forecasting and said, hey, I think the grid might be something we can model using these same kinds of tools. So they built models that look at 10,000 times more data points than the conventional utility models. They're capable of examining resources on this distribution side of the system and picking them, and ultimately optimizing the use of those resources so that we right size our choices. If you need 6 ounces of tomatoes, why buy that big can on the bottom shelf? For gosh sakes, you'll be swimming in tomatoes. You can't, even if you save on each unit of toilet paper roll. There's only so many Costco or Sam's packages of toilet paper you should be wanting to buy. And if you're stockpiling that much toilet paper, stop. It's not necessary, and it's a waste of your money, right? So we can right size our solutions. We can match that increment of demand very precisely, and that avoids the swap, the spillage, the waste, and helps reduce costs. But some other cool things happen with distributed resources as well. So we break through the middle territory, we enable much more choices, we can ask many more questions because we can look at much more data, and we can do other really cool things as well. And I'll try to get to some of them. So how do you test this? Well, in model world, you set up one scenario, and then you set up another scenario, and you compare them. These are the scenarios we set up. We had heard so many times that those large central station utility plants were the least cost of choice, the cheapest alternative. We heard that so many times, we said, okay, fine. We're gonna do a scenario where we stop the growth. Just like Nevada silly did quite unreasonably a couple of years ago. We're just gonna stop the growth of distributed solar. We're gonna stop net metering. We're gonna stop all that distributed solar stuff, leave it where it's at. And then we're going to compare that to a scenario in which we actually do optimize these distributed resources. So if that large scale stuff really is the least cost solution, then that should be the lowest cost. And if these small resources really are the most expensive overall, then that should be the highest cost. But of course, as you already know, exactly the opposite came out because of that best fit that you get from right-sized resources and from other effects as well. Now, by the way, we're looking at the total system cost, and this is something Rosanna also sort of has had embedded in the way those folks are looking very creatively at the way these transmission charges are built. What matters is the cost, not just of making the power at the power plant, but getting it to your toaster or to the pot in which you're stirring up your spaghetti sauce. So more complicated but more correct analysis looks at the transmission and distribution assets that are used to move the power. Things that are cheap but far away can actually end up being expensive by the time you get in the car and drive to get them, right? And this is the person that drives 20 miles to save half a cent per gallon on gas. They probably didn't really save money once they got the tank filled and got home. So we compared these two scenarios, and that's where the difference in the savings comes about. On the solar side, we said, look, this sustainable growth has got to be serious. So we put numbers in and we said, this is the floor. You got to build this much, you got to add this much rooftop solar, and then you got to add this much community solar, which would be solar that serves multiple customers, not necessarily on rooftops. That's to take advantage of that. And all the fact that you can site it strategically, but also to take advantage of the fact that community solar projects, sort of like community choice aggregation, can actually provide for customers who can't afford their own system. They can participate in the clean energy future. So that's what we required of it. And that's what this looks like in the top chart. It basically builds up those rooftop resources and continues the momentum that you already have, and then starts building up more resources on the community side on top of that. To make that really work, distributed storage comes into being and allows us to time shift our electricity production. So yeah, solar only makes electricity when the sun shines, but with a battery, you can run on it anytime you want. And that beats the heck out of running a diesel generator to get electricity, obviously, at nighttime or in some other period of time. Overall, the California mix doesn't look a lot different between the utility scale and the local storage. But if you look at the chart, top of the chart on the right, what you'll notice is that, like a healthier ecosystem, there's more diversity in that chart, right? And that diversity is brought about by rooftop solar, community solar, and distributed storage, those three bands at the top. There's still a whole heck of a lot of utility scale resources that are needed, but slightly less. And that means a little less pressure on some of our land resources because, of course, as we already know, distributed resources can be co-located more easily with the places in which we live and work. And we don't have to take up so much of our wildlands to get to them. So overall, not too much of a difference, but a big difference in those savings, that $120 billion in cumulative savings. That savings, by the way, assumes that everybody pays for everything. Now, if anybody brings any of their private money, like net metering customers do, the savings actually go up. But this assumes that all the cost of the new system or the future system is collected through rates. And obviously, when people make private investments in things like net metering or community solar memberships, they're supplementing the rates. They're subsidizing all the other customers. And so when customers invest in net metering today, they're actually helping us get on a curve of big savings. And notice that the savings are positive every year. They're a little slow out to 2040. But then when you start really electrifying the entire California economy, those savings actually build. The more things you serve with clean electricity, with the distributed energy resources, the better off you are in terms of cumulative savings. You also change the shape of the electricity consumption, and this is one of and production. And this is one of the really cool things about how distributed resources help. They're just a solution for what you do, but they change the shape of the entire market. And what that means is that as this chart shows, that what is usually a very peaky utility system with a system that is fully utilized only a relatively few hours of the year actually gets leveled out when this blue part gets taken away, and distributed resources create savings over 80% of the hours in the year. So it's a real deal that saves money in some serious ways. I'm going to go through this fast toward the end so we get to the questions, but another way this shows up is that instead of chasing the crazy bumpiness of our peak demand across the hours, these are the summer hours of the year, those distributed resources smooth out the demand and make it easier for the utility to meet our needs. So it reduces the cost they have to pass on to us in rates. You accelerate your performance on reducing emissions. That's an insurance policy against uncertainty as you get to the really hard reductions that come at the end. You build incremental jobs because distributed resources are more labor intense than utility scale resources. And those jobs typically spend their money in local economies. So there's multiplier effects. We didn't quantify those in this study, but we know they're additional and they make the savings and benefits even bigger as we go forward. Those job benefits are seen in every county in California. They're not just localized, they're spread across just like the resources are. So the deal is pretty good overall. So the answer to the question implicitly posed by both Kurt and Rosanna is, wow, these are really good policy recommendations you people have, because they're actually going to put us on the road to saving a lot of money, getting a more distributed and resilient system, create an opportunity for really improving energy justice, accelerating achievement of our carbon dioxide reductions, growing economic development for everyone, and just doing things smarter. So tell me what time to go over for dinner. All right, that's it. And we left some policy recommendations. I won't get into them because actually my colleagues already talked about some of the really big, important ones. More, once again, the web link, and be glad to join in the Q&A.
Wonderful.
And I'll stop the share and we can go back to dialogue.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. That brings us to the end of our formal presentations, and we can move into Q&A now. And there's a few different ways to ask questions in the Q&A. One is you're welcome to raise your hand, and you can ask a question of our speakers directly. Two, you can put something in the chat, and I will pick it up and ask our speakers on your behalf. And a few of you have already registered questions via email before the show. So we'll start off with a question from Steve Bloom. Steve, you're welcome to go on camera and ask the question directly, or I'll go ahead and ask it on your behalf.
Oh, no, you just go ahead. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Steve asks, how does Carl's 65 gigawatt rooftop solar figure relate to Rosanna's 25% minimum figure?
That's a great question. Please move on to the next question while I look at a spreadsheet and see if I can come up with a quick answer.
Okay,
And
great.
I'll say from our end, the 25% is just sort of a general aspirational figure. And we have seen, in fact, I can find a link on our site where we did a little research on places around the country and the world that had actually achieved much higher penetrations of local renewables than that.
Wonderful. Good, Carl. I'll go to the next question while you're digging into some of the
Thanks.
numbers there. One of the other questions that we've got is for Rosanna specifically, it's how, if you look at a normal Edison bill, a Southern California Edison bill, you do not see transmission access charges listed in your bill. So how does a normal ratepayer see transmission access charges?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is a section of the bill that does talk about transmission, and it won't say transmission access charges, I think, but I haven't looked at my bill for a while, but I can tell you that some years ago, I actually partnered with someone at a solar company to try to kind of dissect utility bills and explain them to solar customers, and we gave up. I think they make them inscrutable on purpose. So as you can see, this issue is not very well known, and people don't know what they're paying. So you can find a light item. I should go on my bill and look. You can find something that mentions transmission hidden in there, but it's not easy to actually get to that and see what we're all really paying.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Carl, do you want another chance at the 65 gigawatts comparing to the 25% minimum figure, or do you want me to go to the next question and come back?
I probably need to pass because I've got this gigantic spreadsheet, but I'd have to select certain things on it. Let me just eyeball it real quickly. The model by the year 2050 would have about let me see, utility scale solar 217 and wind in their range of 85, so we'd be able to 300, 30, 50. Actually, this is kind of interesting. It's pretty close to the 25. It's actually, I think it's a little bit higher than the 25. Roughly speaking, it looks to be, I don't know, maybe about 70,000 gigawatts out of 300 gigawatts, roughly speaking. So it's about in the 25 range, actually. So it's pretty close to that number. There's a lot of fields here because a lot of technologies at the moment, you're like, tomatoes in the grocery store, right? There's a lot of options here that I'm looking at, and I'm not doing the math really fast, but it's in the ballpark.
Yeah, I see that the 65 gigawatt number, if you looked at the state's total capacity in 2050, the 65 gigawatt number might be
Right.
somewhere in the vicinity of 25%.
Yeah, and do remember that we're also talking about electrifying all transportation and all building thermal load by 2050 as well, because we really can't get after carbon unless we do that. So the total capacity, as you saw on that one chart, grows, gosh, like twice or more out between now and 2050. So that's all happening at the same time.
Kurt, did you want to jump in?
Well, yeah, I'm looking at some CPUC numbers from their integrated resource planning models that talk about what kind of solar build out they're going to hit to meet the 2045 SP100 targets. And it is, if you look at what they're projecting in terms of customer solar versus utility scale, it's in the ballpark of what Rosanna talked about, 25%. Actually, it's more. What I think is most interesting, and this was manifest in Carl's slides as well, was just huge amounts of storage.
Yeah.
That most people don't really grok. You know, I sort of alluded to that, you know, when I was talking about the, you know, the EV market and that, you know, there's just going to be a massive amount of storage driving around on the streets in the near term. And then what was amazing, I asked a question, there was a statewide sort of presentation made by the chief modeler who was working on the integrated resource plan. And I just said straight up, you guys, you know, they've got all this modeling and they disaggregating their models between utility scale solar and customer sided solar. They don't disaggregate between, you know, utility owned solar and customer, I mean, storage and customer owned storage. Like they just didn't have a column that would reflect all. And he said he's like, yeah, we haven't thought about it. You're right. There's like, you know, huge amount of distributed storage. And it's completely absent from all the state modeling right now, which is rather appalling, but there you have it.
You know, this is Kurt. What Kurt's saying is exactly the same situation. I said, like, what, you know, when you're raised as a hammer, every opportunity looks like a nail. When you think everything is central station, you think every solution is central station. When storage is one of those places where it really is going to make a difference. It's pretty much true. I think that in the future, if we do this right, the last technology most of us will see, the technology that faces our electricity demand, is going to be a storage device of some kind. And the question that the operator is going to have to answer, and that we're going to have to answer, is what are we filling it with? So I was actually talking to some of those same folks just yesterday, and one of them said, well, isn't storage doing all the work? This isn't about just distributed solar, is it? And I was like, you got to fill the battery with something, and it's got to be the least cost resource. And often that's going to be the resource that generates clean, carbon-free electricity right nearby. So it does matter, right? But yeah, we can't, and that storage provides that resilience benefit. That's why I said, start thinking of that as the substitute for that diesel genset, because that's what it provides. It provides dispatchability for a variable renewable that can be locally sited.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You've got to put some electricity in the battery somehow, right?
Yep.
Question from one of our board members, Richard, for Rosanna. Rosanna, wouldn't TAC reform unfairly burden those homeowners like urban dwellers who then bear a larger burden of the regional transmission equipment charges?
No, in a word, no. So when we fix TAC, everyone will be paying less because we won't pay those additional charges on the local energy. But the way it works is not that if you have solar on your roof, you pay specific to that. The TAC charges are socialized among all ratepayers. So it's through a whole utility service territory. So if you're here in PG&E where I am, it doesn't matter if you're the person generating the power, if you're using local power or remote power, you're going to pay the same percentage on your bill based on the total amount. So it will actually lower costs for everyone. Does
Very
that answer
good.
the
And
question?
Richard, does that answer your question? Oh, Richard, you're on mute.
Sorry, I unmute myself. Yeah, basically, I thought if the transmission costs are a fixed number because we have these giant towers and all this other substations, they're not going to go down because we take out charges to people or change the formula. So people who live close to a generator of solar or whatever, actually you take into account that their electricity goes a shorter distance. You still have the same costs. It's just, I don't understand. I didn't understand how that worked.
Right, well, yeah, so it's not so much that it's all going to go down as that it will avoid building new transmission. It'll keep our costs from going up. And again, it's spread out over the whole utility service territory. So it doesn't matter how close you are to any source of generation. Does that make sense?
it makes sense in that the way you said it. So there's a long-term effect by requiring less equipment, let's say, for
Less power lines.
yeah, for power. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. I get
Very good. Question from Bernadette. For any of our speakers, what do you think about home storage? Do you think it's going to be more accessible to more people soon? Do you think that's going to play a bigger and bigger role in this picture that we're talking about? Kurt?
I'm just gonna ride my EV horse again, we're all gonna, my wife said, hey, what are we gonna do? I actually went out and bought one of these little Yeti batteries. It's got, it can I can run my instant on shower in my fridge for 24 hours. And I got priced from Enphase and Powerwall, some of these things. And it was, you get between 10 and, 13 kilowatt hours, whatever. But it was like $15,000-$20,000. And I, started looking at, well, I could get a used Nissan Leaf for, $5,000. It's got 5 to 6 times the amount of battery storage, which is going to be in your Powerwall. And so I think what's going to happen is, if you look at the marketing that's going on, I don't know if people saw the Ford and the F-150 Bolt, and part of their marketing shtick is, oh, you're going to run your house when the grid goes down. It's kind of a complicated story, because if you look at the different models that are currently available in the EV market, like some are the Nissan Leaf, I think a couple of Volkswagens, BMW, they're wired for that. The Teslas are specifically not, and that's a long story. I think Tesla doesn't want to cannibalize their own product, which is the Tesla Powerwall, which is they're not selling that as a feature right now in terms of but ultimately, I think when people figure out that, gee, I can run my house from my my $20,000 Nissan Leaf, but I can't run my house from an $80,000 Tesla, that's going to become ultimately a marketing problem, I think, for Tesla. And so they're going to come around. So I think that what's going to happen is, we're all going to figure out a way. And there's multiple vendors, Decibel, some others at the residential scale, Fermata Energy, they're trying to figure out how to do this on a broader, fleet basis, where we're all going to have a battery sitting in our driveway, and we're all going to get resilience. And we're not necessarily going to need to be buying Powerwalls and stuff. So it's going to be a huge thing, but it's going to be in our driveway.
Thanks for that. That's batteries on wheels.
Batteries on wheels.
Yeah, good. Rosanna or Carl, do you want to comment on that, or should we go to the next question?
Well, I'll just add in, from a technological development or industry development perspective, these batteries like PV and cars run on economies of manufacturing scale. So we're still falling in price because they're making more of them, and they're getting more efficient, and they're figuring out bugs, and they're finding better materials. So we're sort of getting a Moore's law kind of effect with storage, and most good expectations are that we're going to keep going down on that. The other thing that's ironic about this is that the antipathy that many utilities have had towards rooftop solar is actually driving customers towards not full technical defection. They're not unhooking from the grid, but they're economically defecting, and they're finding ways to separate themselves from the utility's economic trap. And that's driving some of the really big solar companies to just start saying, look, we'll sell you solar, but we'll sell you solar only with a smart inverter. That's pretty much standard now. And we're really going to make it attractive for you to buy it with storage right up front, so that, because those people want their businesses to be successful, that means this has got to pay off for you. And they know storage is a way that investment can pay off even more. So there's a lot of drivers here, some intended, some unintended, that suggests that, I would be pretty optimistic about it. Now, that does not mean you should wait until the price falls so far that it's free, because we need early adopters to help drive us down that cost curve, right? I joke, I've always spent $2,500 every time I bought a computer, all the way back to my Apple II Plus that I bought in 1980, right? But because I was willing to spend that amount of money each time, I contributed to the acceleration of the technology and the improvement in pricing. If we have some money, it's a good thing to do. We can really help the system change.
That's great, Carl. Thank you very much. This question comes from Joan Taylor for Rosanna. Should legislation to remove transmission access charges on distributed generation also incorporate a feed-in tariff for in front of the meter solar on warehouses and that kind of thing?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I'd say, the legislation would probably need to be separate. It's already, it's already challenging to get this TAC legislation going at all. And like we noted, there's a lot of competition right now for energy bills. But I think you're hitting on something important, which is that we do need some kind of mechanism to really, unleash the commercial scale solar market, which is woefully underserved here. And that's the market that propelled Germany with very little sun. I think they have 70% less sun than we have in California to become a global solar leader. We do need a feed-in tariff. And one of the things that we have done at the Clean Coalition has been to design market responsive, cost-effective feed-in tariffs. They can even have adders that incentivize energy storage or incentivize building in low-income communities, that kind of thing. So that is definitely something we need. I think it would need to be in separate legislation, but I think, like I was saying, this TAC piece is a really important and key piece of the puzzle, and there are many others. I think that the thing that's challenging with TAC is that people are not aware of it. Like you said, someone mentioned, and I was just trying to look at one of my power bills. I know I've found this line item before, but I couldn't find it on my recent bill. People don't know what's going on. They don't know that we're paying this extra charge for transmission on all our energy. So I think that's a really key message to get forward. But yes, we absolutely also need a feed-in tariff. And there are many other things we need to fix in the policy area, like interconnection, which I think Kurt touched on, is a huge one. Soft costs are still a big issue with solar in the United States. But yeah.
Kurt, you wanted to jump in there?
Yeah, so there's a lot that could be said about this. So we used to have a program in California called REMAT, stands for Renewable Energy Market Adjusted Tariff, and there was a standard contract available if you were a certain type of resource under 3 megawatts, and you could go in and you could get a fixed priced feed-in tariff contract. It was $89 a megawatt hour. You can get a fixed 10 or 15 or 20-year contract, which was a screaming deal. That program was paused. There was a legal challenge, something called PERPA. It's kind of a long story. That program just came back about a week and a half ago at the PUC. So REMAT is back, and so there's an amount of capacity available in each of the investor and utility service territories, which is a feed-in tariff. I mean, I spent 10 years as a developer. When you can go and you can just grab a number and you can prop it in your spreadsheet if you're trying to decide. It's hugely important. So that is back, and albeit it has limited capacity. There is part of the microgrid proceeding, which is currently pending before the PUC. It's going to come up. I mean, the whole goal, there's a bill called SB 1339 signed into law in 2018. The stated purpose of that was to commercialize the microgrid industry. Well, that has not happened. It's been a real slog before the PUC. But this question that's articulated here is still pending for further sort of tracks in the microgrid, proceeding. I would bet, given everything that's happened to date in the microgrid proceeding, that that's not going to be perceived as a win, but it is theoretically going to be discussed and will be rendered, a decision by the PUC in the next year.
This really points out the huge opportunity for advocacy for folks like you and your friends and others that you can influence, right? We have the policies, we know which ones work and which ones don't. We now have the modeling that shows us the roadmap on where we've got to go in order to save money and realize our policy objectives at the same time. But there's huge execution risk. I'm not sure it won't happen if we do nothing. It'll just take probably 50 years longer, and God knows what the world will be like. So people have to take action, and our policymakers have to take another look at their assumptions, at their mental furniture, and realize that, hey, these distributed resources have value and it can now be quantified. and that the policies need to be reinforced, not gutted, like they're talking about, like the utilities want to do with net metering. And this is an inflection point moment, and we're not guessing about it anymore. We know what we need to do. Now we have to tell them to do it.
Get it implemented.
I think the studies like the one Carl presented about are really powerful tools in that, because they really show you, look, this is, if we deploy a lot more local solar, this is how much we'll save. And no one's ever done such a sophisticated study before. And I think that it's also very important to note that it's not about local versus remote, although, you know, most of us are proponents of local solar, but that these two work really well in concert together. And that study really shows how that works.
That's wonderful. And if it's possible, Carl, we'd love to link to that study and post that on our website after the presentation tonight. We can get that up in the next week. We'll close with one last question, and then I'll turn it over to April to say a few closing words. Steve Bloom, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come off mute and ask a question, Steve?
There we go. Yeah, so I hate this the last question because it's a little bit downer, but kind of goes to the sort of the purpose of, you know, having the Desert Coalition sponsor this meeting, and that is, you know, all those big plants out in the desert. It was mentioned a few minutes ago, the Ford announcement. I don't know if everybody saw that, but basically Ford is, without having hardly gotten out of the starting gate on EVs, is doubling its production plants, you know, right off the bat. And we're seeing an acceleration in EV adoption, and I think it's really taking off now. And frankly, and you know, people like Tony Siva have been talking about this for a while, but you know, I think we're looking at maybe 2028, and we'll be seeing, you know, all new cars in California be EVs, possibly even slightly sooner. And so that's going to be a very, very fast ramp up in the electric demand for EVs. And the problem is that on top of the current trend with building the big plants out in the desert, then you're talking about that huge increase in demand. And if we don't have a big expansion in rooftop kind of, you know, ready to go and actually happening, then that capacity is all going to the desert. And it just looks like a train wreck.
Well, so one thing I would say to that is that you can deploy local solar much more quickly. We do need the right policies and market mechanisms to incentivize those deployments and make them happen. You know, like we mentioned, we have interconnection issues, we have issues with soft costs, but it can go much more quickly that way than big utility scale plants.
Robin, did you want to weigh in?
I just want to say one thing. I have to say, I mean, we're in another environmental education nonprofit that works every day to try to get the utility scale solar shifted from the desert onto rooftop, onto fallow ag, onto disturbed lands and all that. And sometimes, you know, we look at a webinar like this as like, okay, look at everybody who's signed up. You're preaching to the choir, right? I mean, really, there's nobody here we're trying to convince. We are all on the same page. But I want to thank the California Desert Coalition for doing this, because all of us who are going out and trying to pound the pavement to get this message out, we need this kind of information. And all three of your speakers were fabulous. And Rosanna, I just want to tell you, the Summer Tree Institute will sign on to anything you have. Absolutely. I need to get your email address. We will sign on to everything. This week, okay, I've been working, the Summer Tree Institute's been working since August with the Desert Inlands Coalition, responding to the California National Research, you know, the 30 by 30 plan, and CARB's involvement in it is abysmal. CARB has dropped the desert from all of their modeling, mapping, classification system, everything, because they say we're only inorganic carbon. You can't manage inorganic carbon, so we're going to leave you out. So I've just been writing all kinds of things. And right now we're working with Steve Lopez from the LA Times, trying to get him to bring this up to the public. All of us, we're all on the same page, but these webinars are so critical because the kind of information you have given us tonight, I have to tell you, I've taken a picture of every single PowerPoint page, because this is the information I'm feeding to Steve Lopez from LA Times to get him to write a piece, because we're talking amongst ourselves. We have to get this out to the man on the street. We have to get this out to everybody, all these things. And the whole transmission charges is a big thing I already talked to Steve Lopez about. But Rosanna, you gave me things. I'm going to send him more information about that. This is so important. It's not really a question, or it's just, it's a thank you to the CDC for doing this, and for you three speakers to come on, because even though you're speaking to the choir, we are taking this empirical information and putting it out to the public. And that's what Summer Tree Institute is all about, is getting this information out to the public in terms they can understand, and trying to generate responses to the California Natural Resources Board and to CARB and to, all of these things. So this is really just a big thank you for doing this tonight. I've gotten so much information, and I'm telling you, we are already in the trenches working for this, but the specific information you give us is more arrows in our quiver to get this information out. So thank you all three so much. And thank you to CDC for doing this. That's
Thanks,
all.
Robin, and please do, I put my email in the chat. Please do email me. I'd love to talk to you more about TAC.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rosanna.
And there's a couple more questions, but we're just about out of time for the evening. And so Judy, if you want to email your question over to the speakers or put it in the chat, we'll make sure and get it answered.
Oh, it's in there. It's been there a while. But I want to make sure that Robin knows about LA 100, LADWP's, report, which undermines local solar to an unbelievable degree. It's relegated to 2 paragraphs on page 89. So I'm wondering if anyone is engaged with that. It's outrageous, outrageous, but maybe Steve Lopez will be interested,
Yes, my email, robin@summertree.org, and email that to me, because we have the ear of Steve Lopez. And we are trying to get this out, because as much as all of us know about this, it doesn't do any good to talk about it amongst ourselves. We have to get it out to the masses and have them help us bombard Sacramento with it.
But it's not only Sacramento. I mean, I'm just hoping that, I don't know, I'm curious what kind of public education each of these groups does, because nobody knows about what's going on,
No.
Exactly.
And I'm talking from LA. That's, it's really bad. So,
Exactly. But you know what? What happens in the desert affects you.
oh no, that's why I'm here,
Yeah.
because I
Yes.
absolutely know what happens in the desert is related
Yes.
here. There's no question.
Email me. Okay.
But
email
I'm
me.
curious about the groups that are talking, like what kind of public education you do about this. That's what I'm curious about.
Right. Because that's all important. We can talk amongst ourselves and be the most erudite people and inform people. We have to get all this information that just came out tonight out to the public. That's where we're going to make change.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Judy. I think Carl, Rosanna, or Kurt, if you have any short last closing thoughts that you'd like to respond to the group with. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to April, our board president, to close. Carl, Rosanna, Kurt, any last thoughts?
Nothing but thank you. The first step is paying attention. The second step is sharing. The third step is influencing. So you guys are already on the way, and I appreciate being a part of the good work you're doing.
Thank you.
Yeah, and to Judy's question, the Clean Coalition doesn't do a lot of public education. We have been working hard to educate policymakers, regulators about these issues. But Robin, if we could get one thing I have been trying to do is also get journalists interested, because it does help to get a push from the public. That's just not usually our target as an organization, but I think we need to get this out there more, definitely.
Feed us the information and we'll get it out.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Kurt?
So our website is theclimatecenter.org. We have a mailing list. We do a lot of webinars, public education. We have a biweekly newsletter about all things climate, climate policy, distributed energy. So go to theclimatecenter.org, sign up for our newsletter.
Okay.
Excellent. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, excellent. Thank you all. April Saul, board president, co-founder of the CDC. Thank you, speakers, for your time today. We know how valuable it is, and thank you all that joined. It really comes down to us being able to share the message and getting more advocates into this conversation. And I'm going to launch a really quick poll, because we would like to do more of this Defend the Desert, as well as more solar specific webinars in the new year, and your responses do matter. And also, if there's anything that you want to put in the chat about what works for you timing wise, or any other particular topics of interest, feel free to put that in the chat, and we will save the chat in addition to having this recording. Fraser, can you show that last slide as well, where we're finishing here?
I just gotta get it off of here.
And then I just want to reiterate, CDC is a nonprofit that is, funded all by private donations, as well as, gifts from the public and from supporters like you. So we are all volunteer board members. We appreciate any support that you can send. We'll be doing a end of the year giving campaign that starts here on the Giving Day, November 30th, and we'll go into December. So we appreciate anything you can send our way, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year and having a whole new arsenal of webinars, and hopefully in-person webinars again very soon. So thank you, Fraser, and our speakers for helping organize this one, and really appreciate everyone that joined tonight. Have a great night.